Welcome back, everyone, and we're going to talk about asset standards. Again, my name is Lynn Weiss, and I'm going to be your instructor for this session. The topics that we're going to discuss include standard levels. What in the world do you need to manage? What levels of detail do you need to manage to? We're going to talk about what your goals are, and your goals may be different than others' goals. We're going to talk about what to manage, what's necessary, what you'll need, because remember, software works with hardware, and what are the requirements between the two. And then, unfortunately, we have an exercise designing your managed standards list. So, what are asset standards? They're a designation of a level of equipment and the software, like I said, deemed appropriate for a particular job or role within the organization. And it's up to you to work with the others in the organization to determine what those standard levels are. So, some of the goals that exist around creating standards, why are we doing this, would be to provide guidance to the approval managers, because not all of them are IT knowledgeable or IT experts. So you want to help give them a little bit of guidance. Also, to build some sort of a homogeneous environment within the organization so you can add those levels of control in areas of security, business continuity, and flexibility when it comes to moving the asset management environment forward into the future. Also, you want to control costs when it comes to acquisition, maintenance, and supporting those assets. And what does that look like now and in the future? And of course, aligning the procurement with the technology goals, which may not always seem like they're in alignment because IT has its own goals, and your procurement departments typically who are the ones that are buying the assets, if you as a hardware asset manager are not doing it yourselves, they typically have a different set of goals. So this is about a meeting of the minds here in bringing the financial and the IT together in order to come up with some sort of a strategic direction for IT asset management. And then, of course, to remove those barriers that exist between the departments, whether it's between financial and IT or the end user and IT, you want to break down some of those barriers and make sure there's a better understanding from one to the other. Also, building relationships with your vendors. Remember, I said at the beginning of this course that you are forming a lasting relationship with your vendors, and you're going to basically have a marriage, so to speak, between you and the vendor. So you've got to try to build that win-win and good relationship so that the vendor's willing to work with you, especially in times when you have issues or problems that need resolution. And then you want to create a pool of assets for redeployment, disposal, and policy enforcement. Not too big, but you want to make sure that you can support the organization when errors occur, when assets are lost or stolen, hopefully not many. And you want to make sure that if there's a breakdown somewhere, that you can replace it quickly and expediently to make sure that people have what they need to do their jobs and there's no interruption to the production environment. Also, a big one on this slide is to improve budget forecasting. How else are you going to know what you need to buy for the next fiscal year or the next calendar year if you don't have an understanding of what you already own? And that's what asset management is going to help bring as far as supporting the organization. It'll help bring an understanding of what you need to budget for the future. Here's an example of a typical laptop standard. Some of the information that you may want to gather on your devices. Things such as model, manufacturing SKU, price, manufacturer, number of processors, etc. The software, if you notice down towards the bottom, the operating system, the office suite, anything else that's on that asset that you need to track. So therefore, you're going to have to work with not only you and your team of hardware asset managers, you're going to have to work with the software asset management team as well and make sure that the view that you are managing the view that you're documenting is appropriate for the needs of the organization. Here's just one example. So looking at the standards, having standards in place helps direct the focus to the exception. Standard acquisitions, standards within the organization should be quick, easy, very few keystrokes or human intervention to get that asset from purchase to someone's desktop. So therefore you can focus on the exceptions, that 20% out of the 80-20 mix. 20% should be your exceptions potentially, even less if you're lucky. How do you manage those exceptions? What are the processes to deal with the exceptions? It's an important first step to any kind of process improvement or tool implementation, having standards. What are we going to manage? How can we make this better? Obviously, your security plan, your folks that work in the security team with your IT infrastructure, they'll be very happy to have a controlled environment. Good standards can't be developed by IT alone, even though many of you, like me, would love to be sitting in a room all by themselves creating standards like an evil mad scientist for everyone else to have to follow. That's my dream. It's probably best not to do it that way. So you've got to engage a team of people, including IT, management, cross-functionally across many departments, including end users, security, people that are going to be impacted, help desk, those folks that are going to be impacted by the asset itself. And then consider that same team for setting up minimal acceptable equipment and other aspects of the hardware asset management program on down the line. So how do you determine what assets to manage and what standards to create? The questions you have to ask yourself is, when do the costs of managing those outweigh the benefits? So look at things such as salary and benefits of the resources, such as your help desk, your service management, or what about an outsourcing arrangement? Is it way too costly and unmanageable? How about tracking the assets? Are you using a spreadsheet because you're only a 5-man company? Or are you using tools that are costing you astronomical amounts of money that makes it way too expensive? So you've got to look at that. What does it take to track those assets? And then what about creating the processes, procedures, and policies and the standards to manage those assets? Can you get a consensus? Can you get agreement from all the business units in order to move forward? That is extremely important. You've got to be able to work as a team. And then, of course, what are the costs associated with the automation? What about the tools themselves? And then look at the management decisions based on things such as trends. Consider some of the following things. Auditors that are asking you questions about assets and assets within the organization, whether they're leased or whether they're purchased. You know, auditors always want to know, is this something you have bought, or is this something that's leased and someone else actually owns it? And what data is on that? And is it appropriate? There was a news report that mentioned a PC for sale that was out on eBay some time ago, and this is only one example. I'm sure you can think of many others because we see news examples of this all the time, where someone either left an asset tag on an asset that was disposed of and it was disposed of improperly, or that someone got a hold of data from a hard drive that was not properly wiped, and now the confidential information of all their customers is out there. I know in my particular history, I got a letter from maybe about 10 years ago from the phone company I was using saying that an asset with possibly my information on it was lost. So therefore, they were giving me 3 months worth of credit protection for myself to make sure that no one had secured my information and was out there using my information as their own. What happened next was I dropped the phone company and went to another organization for my phone service. You've got to think of what are the bad press and the downstream effects of lost or stolen assets or something like this hitting the press. What could that do to your organization? It could be devastating from a business perspective or from a legal perspective as well. You've got to think about that. So, when we look at the criteria for managing assets, you've got to look at certain things. No matter how many times I want to tell people cost should not be a factor, there's always a budget. Cost is always a factor. Now, the opposite of that is, what about those little tiny assets such as smartphones? It's not so much cost, it's going to be risk of those assets being lost or stolen. So you've got to look at things such as cost. You've got to look at things such as, how many of these assets do we have in the environment? Do we manage them because we have so many? And also, what about life expectancy? If their life expectancy, like in smartphones these days, is only 18 months, is it worth it? But what about something that's going to last us about 10 years? Of course you want to manage that. Expectation for maintaining stock internally? Do we need to have an inventory of these assets for replacement? Of course you want to manage those types of assets. Also, any assets that are covered by a maintenance fee. You do not want to have the situation, which perfect example I can tell you about is, we had a member that took this course a number of years ago, and it was one of the first courses that I taught. And he, after, I think it was about 2 or 3 days, went back to his organization and looked at all their maintenance contracts. And after a few days analysis, walked into his boss's office, and the story basically is wrapped up into these few sentences. He said, I have good news and I have bad news. And his boss said, well, give me the good news first. He said, well, I just saved, by evaluating maintenance contracts, I just saved the company about $1.2 million US in savings for years to come. And his boss said, that's fantastic. All from taking the CHAMP course and looking at our assets. Great, but what's the bad news? And he said, well, don't kill the messenger here, but that's how much we've been spending on maintenance costs for assets that have been sitting on the shelf over the past 3 years. You don't want that to be your organization. Good news, bad news. So other costs and contracts associated with this asset. You've got to be aware of the software that is impacting this asset and what those contracts are, and anything else that may impact that asset. So other criteria to look at. Security risks, like I mentioned on the previous slide. Sure, smartphones are cheap. Maybe it doesn't fall within the criteria as far as management from a dollar perspective, but it should from a security perspective. Do you have remote wipe capabilities? How about legislated or requirements as far as governance, as far as protecting your data? If you're a healthcare organization, or if you're a pharmaceutical or some government agency that has to maintain certain data on its customers, how do you protect that? Also, assets that are leased. You don't want to be paying for something long after it's gone. Impact of loss and productivity to the organization. What's your turnaround if an asset is lost? How long does that user have to wait before one is replaced? And then asset redeployment. Is it an asset that you can redeploy or you're just going to destroy? You want to make sure you look at that. And then finally, mobility within the organization, or whether it's mobile and going out. I typically use a laptop, so it travels with me around the country, around the world, wherever I go. And you've got to consider, what are the security measures that we take in order to safeguard that asset if it ever goes missing? So, examples of managed assets. Take a look at this chart here. This is something that's going to be used in the exercise forthcoming. So, looking at the asset type, a laptop, desktop, servers, there are reasons noted on this chart as to why you would consider managing each of these assets. But some of these may be something that's used in your organization or considered, some may not. You may not have governance, you may not be concerned about the cost, but in many cases, risk is going to be the determining factor for many of these asset types. So consider it. Create your own managed asset report. And then choose the correct management level. What detail is required for you to manage? What about how we get that data? Do we have the capability of getting that data? Is the vendor supplying it to us? Is it easily determined from an discovery tool or whatever tools we have available? What about automation tool capabilities? When you're looking at what tools you have in the organization, and we're going to talk about this later on in the course, you want to make sure that you're flexible in order to incorporate new assets into the mix. And then assess reporting needs and decision making. Who needs to have access to this data? What types of reports do you need? What types of integration into other systems do you need to have? That may help you determine what you manage at what time. And you don't have to do everything at once. Make this a phased-in approach. Make it work for the organization. So now, as a final piece of this segment, let's talk about the managed standards list, as we had on that previous slide. Go to the exercise guide from the course materials tab of the course page and download the exercise and complete it. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you on the next module.